and we are delighted to be back again for another session of the Poetry of Jewish Memory with Mr. Daniel Kraft. And it feels like we elected a good schedule as we're moving from Yom HaZikaron to Yom Ha'atzmaut. Both of those holidays interact with memory. One of them has it in the name, but as I think those of us who were here last week realized, this is going to be a much broader class than Mr. Kraft's first class with us, which again, people were filling up my inbox with requests to have him back, and we're very, very glad to have him back continuing this work. So as a reminder to those here with us on Zoom, I'll be sending you an invitation to become a panelist. That does not obligate you to do anything. It does not take anything away from you. It just lets you into the room. You can share your video if you wish. When we have opportunities for discussion and participation, folks do tend to be very participatory with Mr. Kraft, which we appreciate, and he gives people opportunities to read sometimes. If you would like to practice reading in English poetry, there's still an art to it. But you are, of course, welcome to put questions and comments in the chat. If you're joining us out in Facebook land, you are acknowledged. We cherish your learning, and you can participate by putting your questions and comments in the comment section directly below the video. I will take a peek now and then to make sure that you can be part of the conversation too, if you would like. Otherwise, you're welcome to be a lurker and just listen and learn and enjoy. And without further ado, please, Mr. Kraft.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. It's good to see some familiar faces, or not faces because everyone has their cameras off, which is totally fine, but familiar names from last week, and also some new names. So I'm really excited to dive into this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see what I'm sharing okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. So, as was already mentioned, it's Yom Ha'atzmaut. It was just Yom HaZikaron, right? Israeli Independence Day, and it was just the Israeli Memorial Day. And so I thought it would be apt and worthwhile to focus our readings tonight on Israeli poets and Israel in poetry, and also on Hebrew, modern Hebrew, as a poetic language, and what that means in itself as a form for the transmission of memory, as a vehicle of memory, not through content, but through form. So that's where we're going to start by thinking aloud a little bit. But I do want to reiterate that I don't want this to just be me lecturing. So if people have comments, questions, responses, please don't hesitate to to participate. I would really enjoy this as a conversation. So we're going to start tonight by looking at a text from Gershom Scholem. So this is a letter that Gershom Scholem wrote to the great Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig. Scholem was, of course, the great towering scholar of Jewish mysticism. Rosenzweig was a good friend of his. It's possible, if not probable, it's probable that this letter was never actually sent, but it was discovered among his effects. And to my mind, just to put all my cards on the table, I think this is one of the most fascinating pieces of modern Jewish thought. I really do. It's this odd sort of piece of ephemera that to me is just endlessly fascinating. So we're starting with this because I think it's a really interesting and strange, unusual way of framing what it means to revitalize the Hebrew language as a living language. And most of the poets, maybe not most, but many of the poets we're going to be looking at tonight wrote in Hebrew. And so I want to start by thinking about the ways that Hebrew itself, irrespective of what is done with Hebrew, functions as a vehicle for memory. So we'll go ahead and read this letter, and I'm really curious to hear what people make of it. So Gershom Scholem writes, "This country is a volcano. and language is lodged within it. People here talk of many things that may lead to our ruin, and more than ever of the Arabs. But there is another danger, how much more uncanny than the Arab nation, and it is a necessary result of the Zionist enterprise. What of the actualization of the Hebrew language? That sacred language on which we nurture our children. Is it not an abyss that must open up one day? The people certainly don't know what they are doing. They think they have secularized the Hebrew language, have done away with its apocalyptic point. But that, of course, is not true. The secularization of the language is no more than a manner of speaking, a ready-made expression. It is impossible to empty the words so bursting with meaning unless one sacrifices the language itself. So I'm thinking about this in terms of Jewish memory, because to me, one of the things that Sholem is saying here is that Hebrew itself carries memory. And we ignore that fact at our peril, that there's a memory embedded in the words of Hebrew. So if we continue this, language is name. The power of language is enclosed in the name. The abyss of language is sealed within it. Now that we've invoked the ancient names day after day, we can no longer hold off the forces they contain. Once awakened, they will appear, for we have summoned them. It's really intense, and I don't quite have a sense of how literally that he means this, like what exactly have we summoned, and what exactly does that mean? Yeah, Elle, did you wanna share something? I see, let me make sure. Yeah.
Hold on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I want to say that I am a Tanakh teacher in 2 high schools in New York,
Mhm.
and I am constantly telling them that the Hebrew language is so powerful, and that we don't realize that as it's modernized, we are really walking around using biblical speak. We put new energy into an ancient language, and everything we say, we could find the root of it in the Bible.
Yeah, totally. I think that's exactly what he's getting at here. I think you're spot on, that there is this profound energy in Hebrew itself that is much more powerful than we are aware of, and that we can really handle, and that we really need to be mindful of that.
And Hebrew I'm going to say one more thing. Hebrew,
Yeah,
when you
please.
try to translate, right, the nuances of the Hebrew language into English, it's pretty abysmal, because we really can't pick up the shadows of the words the same way.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. My favorite example of this is the modern Hebrew word for electricity. People here probably know this, chashmal. Where does that come from? It comes from Ezekiel's mystical vision, where in the Bible, chashmal is this like untranslatable, ineffable, electrum, mystical substance. And then it becomes this mundane thing that we call electricity. And so I think that what you're saying, Yael, and what Gershom Scholem is saying here is that we have to really be aware of the memories and the power that comes with those memories that these words contain when we use them casually. Yeah, thank you for chiming in with that. So he continues, and it's a much longer letter. I've sort of excerpted some of the highlights here. Hebrew words, all that are not neologisms, but have been taken from the treasure house of our good old language. Oh, that's not supposed to be there. Are full to bursting with meaning. A generation that takes over the most fruitful part of our tradition, its language, cannot, though it may ardently wish to, live without tradition. When the day finally comes and the force shored up in the Hebrew language is unleashed, when the spoken the content of language takes form once again, our people will find itself confronted anew with that sacred tradition, signifying the choice before them, either to submit or to perish. It's quite dramatic. Because at the heart of such a language in which we ceaselessly evoke God in 1,000 ways, thus calling him back into the reality of our life, he cannot keep silent. So there's so much we could say about it. We could spend an entire class just on this letter. I should add, I can't remember if I said this, but Sholem wrote this in 1926. So what seems now like the success of the Zionist project in terms of the, I mean, you know, in various ways, in terms of the actual institution of a Jewish state, in terms of the actual revitalization of Hebrew as a living language across society, that was not a foregone conclusion. He was writing this when that was still a question over whether and how that might take place. But I wanted to start with this tonight as a way of kind of opening up questions about what it means to write poetry in modern Hebrew, what it means to use Hebrew in the 20th or 21st century as a medium for expressing Jewish memory, and what kind of Jewish memories are necessarily contained in the language itself, and what is the stake? What are the stakes of that? Hopefully that makes sense, but I'm really curious to hear just if anybody has any other kind of general responses to this letter. And Chaya asked about this translation electrum for Chashmal. I have no clue, but it's a great question. Now I want to look it up after this session. But yeah, anybody have any other responses to this letter? How do you understand what he's saying here about the power that Hebrew words hold? And do you agree with him that Hebrew words have this tremendous power that we have to be aware of and we might not necessarily be able to control?
I just want to echo some things that Yael was saying before, because working at Drisha, believe it or not, this comes up for us sometimes, and not just in the work in terms of the teaching part, when you have folks who are focused on literary approaches to Tanakh, to Mishnah, even to Talmud. This comes up a lot because it is a very distinct part of our tradition to have certain ways of dealing with words, and almost like a really interesting sort of word search, obviously a holy and deep word search, as opposed to, just the one that might come up in a child's classroom. But when you hear a word, you're supposed to think about all the other times that you heard hineni, that you read it in the text. What does that mean? What does that connect to? But it also comes up when we're talking about how to write an email, and the way that people might take a biblical reference or not take it. And if we're going, to something midrashic, something out there, it's a question of how many people actually will recognize that language. If you're picking something up from the Zohar, is that a strong enough item there? And then how different that is when you're speaking with your English speaking colleagues and when you're speaking with your Hebrew speaking colleagues, and how funny you might sound to people who are using the language for different things than you are, when like maybe I'm 90% Bible, 10% modern Hebrew. But for other people who are maybe closer to half and half, it sounds very strange to them. And they pick up on different associations than I pick up on when I'm producing my speech, because they live the language differently. But I'm rambling at this point, so I will stop.
No, thank you for putting us back in a kind of practical realm around this, as opposed to just thinking about this as kind of an abstraction, because this has consequences for how we communicate, how we express ourselves in the most mundane ways. Yael, what did you want to add?
I wanted to add, this is a very, very powerful powerfully written excerpt. I almost want to see the rest of the letter, but it reminds me of the book Exodus by Leon Uris, if you're familiar with it.
Mhm.
And in there, he's talking about, I don't know, I guess the survivors being part of like the army, right? Or you know, that they rose up from Europe, and all of a sudden, he said, in front of us, we have Eleazar and Judah and Jonathan. And he's like, it's as if the Maccabees are reliving themselves. And just the idea that even names in Hebrew are laden with so much memory and power, and that when you name somebody Isaac or Jacob, the name just tells a story.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, in a few minutes, we'll be looking at some poetry by the great, probably the greatest modern Israeli poet, Yehuda Amichai, who was born Ludwig Pfeffer in Germany and changed his name from Ludwig to Yehuda, right? Very, very different memory born in those names. Not to mention, of course, Amichai, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, so this is just sort of a way of framing these questions about what remembrance is carried not just by the things that we say, but by the medium we use to say them. And you know, I mean, this is an aside. I'm not going to say much about this, but I think this is true in English as well, right? This is true in any language. I think, you know, we should really try to be aware of the histories of the words that we're using. Judith, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm glad you just added the English part, because I was an English major, and I'm thinking while you're talking, I totally get it, but then I started thinking about phrases from Shakespeare. If you say in English a rose by any other name, it has a valence. If you are educated in it, then it brings all of those meanings with it. But if you're not, and you don't know that it's ancient Shakespearean English, then it'll have no impact on you. And it's the same kind of, quote, secularization process of the English language. Now, it wasn't holy in the way that we consider Hebrew to be holy, but the fact that language carries memory and culture with it, I think, goes across cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree for sure. I think one of the central differences, you know, that Sholom's pointing to with Hebrew here is just its sheer age, right, which English has nothing on, and also the theological weight of so many Hebrew words that seem mundane. But yeah, so much we could say about this. We're going to move on, though, and look not at Hebrew poems first, but at English poems about Hebrew. So we'll do that in a moment. I just wanted to kind of bring back up from last week before we dive into the poems themselves. One of the questions that I was using as a kind of guide. So what argument is this poem making about the nature and experience of Jewish memory? We talked more about this last week, but rather than saying this is what Jewish memory is and this is how the poem explores that, I'd rather treat it as a question that each poem is answering in its own idiosyncratic way. So we are going to look now at two poems by Avia Kushner. I don't know if folks are familiar with her. I know Noah is, and you know, without her, I think I wouldn't be teaching for Drisha. She made this connection last year, so I'm grateful for her. So she's a wonderful poet. These two poems we're going to look at come from her poetry collection called Wolf Lamb Bomb. She's an Israeli American, grew up in the States, but in a Hebrew speaking household. And this whole collection, Wolf Lamb Bomb, is a sort of extended poetic reflection on and response to the book of Isaiah. Some have called it midrashic. I don't want to call it midrash because I think midrash is a particular genre. But she's at least in conversation with midrash. She's midrash adjacent and in conversation very explicitly with Isaiah. And so we're actually we'll start, I think, with this poem here called Ancient Hebrew. I'm going to go ahead and read this one as well, but I'll point out to you what the explicit reference is first. So this poem draws on the book of Isaiah, chapter 32, verse 5, which has this line, Lo yikare od lenaval nadiv ulechilai lo ye'amer shoah. So the JPS translation, right? No more shall a villain be called noble, nor shall gentleman be said of a knave. So I know we have a, yeah, you said you're a Tanakh teacher. You could correct me if this is wrong, but naval, this word for the villain here, if we vocalize it differently, nevel is a harp, a musical instrument. So that's what she's playing on. That's what this poem is playing on. The fact that this verse has this word naval, villain, which could be reread nevel, harp. So this is the poem, Ancient Hebrew. How close the villain is to the harp. 2 vowels separate them, just as 2 small letters separate the harp from the generous. Of course, no one learns languages like this because it's considered wrong, ridiculous. But why is that? That's what I want to know. Yes, the villain can be as mesmerizing as the harp. Yes, evil can seem generous in clever disguise. Yes, all of them have their own rhythms and all are close. Oh, who has not felt the tingling of mischief and crime, sweet music of generosity and still the lingering pluck of am I evil? Am I bad beneath it all? I am giving and villainous and musical. In my body, I carry clarity and crime and the harp. I think it's a wonderful poem. And I think what she's doing here is exactly what we're talking about. She's turning the fact that these words carry so many different memories, so many different lineages, so many different possibilities. She's taking that and running with it and turning it into poetry. Does anyone have any general responses to this poem? Yeah, Judith.
If you don't know Hebrew, then you really don't understand the poem.
Yeah.
I mean, you can kind of, yes, there must be a valence there, but if you don't know what words she's talking about, it has a very different meaning. And it's harder to get to the depth of the meaning. So even though she says she doesn't write in Hebrew, she is in effect in her English writing in Hebrew and so on some level. She's writing both languages at the same time.
I think that's a wonderful point. Yeah, I think that's really astute. This is, even though it's nominally an English poem, this is kind of secretly a multilingual poem. Yeah, totally, totally.
I particularly love this because I do learn languages this way. And it's something that's very important in the more mystical tradition to look at and contemplate the roots of words, the shorashim, and try to understand how they are related. So this poem to me feels very much like a spiritual practice on the page. And in modern Hebrew, when you come up with words that it's obvious with cognates that, okay, that's not referencing a Semitic root there. That's just, something we borrowed from our American friends. It feels like something is lost there to use that in the context of Hebrew roots that are going down deep into our Jewish memory, our Jewish past and continuity. And then you just have these kind of like shallow feeling uh, words cropping up that, we need them in a sense, but they don't have the same resonance. So
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yael, what did you want to add to that?
I wanted to add that, you said like she's Midrash adjacent. And the truth is, I don't know that particular verse, but many times you'll see the, Chazal or the rabbis go ahead and say, don't read it this way, but read it that way. And you just take the same word and you change the vowels, and then there's a whole nother layer to the verse. And I really think she's playing off of that motif.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. It's so cool as poetry, what she's doing here, because she's making a modern lyric poem out of this classic rabbinic interpretive technique that we see all over Midrash, all over Gemara. It's super, super interesting. And I also just want to point out this last line here. In my body, I carry clarity and crime and the harp. So she's taking the different potential valences of these Hebrew words. And where is she locating them? Not in, the text, not in the Tanakh, or I should say not exclusively there, but in her body as something that is carried by her in this, not in an abstract or intellectual way, but in a physical, visceral way. And so to me, that's a big part of, to go back to this question, what argument is this poem making about Jewish memory? To me, that's a big part of how I would answer that question, right? Part of the argument it's making is that these words and the power that they contain and the histories and the memories that they unfold, if we really pay attention to them, they're not outside of us. They're a part of us. And that's part of what Jewish memory is to be in relationship with these languages in such a way that the stories that their words tell are told within us. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's sort of what this makes me think. Yeah, and I'm seeing some really interesting comments here. I'm not good at multitasking and managing the screen share and the faces and the chat, but I'll try periodically to check in on these. Yeah, this question about, right, how would this be different, but how is this different for exilic diasporic languages and works that are translated into Hebrew? I think that's a phenomenal question. I think about this a lot with the Yiddish language, which I spend a lot of time with. And I actually would say that Yiddish often, and my guess is other diasporic Yiddish or Jewish languages, this is true as well. I would say that Yiddish often does something like what Judith was pointing out about this poem, that it's nominally in one language, but it's actually playing across several different languages at once. And so to me, that's a fascinating thing. In the interest of time, we're not going to look at this other poem of Kushner's, but I'll just, everyone has in the chat a link to the handout, which has these poems. So if you want to look at it later, you're more than welcome to. And I'll just say that I think that this poem, I read it as being about what Gershom Scholem is describing, the power that Hebrew contains and being frightened of it. And because of that power, being afraid to write in Hebrew. But I wish we could talk about that, but we're already halfway through with our session. And if you've ever taken a class with me before, you know that I have never once not planned too much. So we're going to move on now to Yehuda Amichai, one of the greats, not just one of the great Hebrew poets, not just one of the great Jewish poets, I think really one of the great poets, full stop, of the 20th century. And since yesterday was Yom HaZikaron and it's Yom HaAtzmaut, I want to look at this poem of his, which is one of my favorites of his. It's a memory. It's a really an elegy for a well, we'll see. We'll see. I don't want to overstate too much, but it's an elegy for somebody who was killed in combat, presumably in 1948. Would anybody like to read this one for us? Since I've read the last two, I'm also happy to keep reading if no one else wants to.
I'm happy to give it a go if no one else is interested. Don't be shy,
No.
folks. Okay. Hulekat, the third poem about Dickie. In these hills, even the oil rigs are already a memory. Here Dickie fell, who was 4 years older than I and like a father to me in times of anguish. Now that I'm older than him by 40 years, I remember him like a young son, and I an old grieving father. And you who remember only a face, don't forget the outstretched hands and the legs that run so easily, and the words. Remember that even the road to terrible battles always passes by gardens and windows, and children playing, and a barking dog. Remember the fruit that fell, and remind it of the leaves and the branch. Remind the hard thorns that they were soft and green in springtime. And don't forget that the fist, too, was once the palm of an open hand and fingers.
Cool. Thank you for reading that for us. This poem always moves me. I'm just kind of curious. Have other folks read this before? Have you come across this poem, or is it new? I don't think it's one of the ones that's like so often, anthologized of his, or at least not as often as some of the other big ones. But yeah, I find it really quite moving. And I also think, I mean, our topic is Jewish memory, and we have, I would say, just like we have in Torah, a repetition here of the commandment. Remember, remember, don't forget. So in a very explicit way, this is a poem that's quite concerned with memory, with what we remember, with what we have to remember, with what we can't allow ourselves to forget. And of course, it opens with this kind of devastating inversion of this relationship, right? Here, Dickie fell. He was like a father to me. Now I'm 40 years older than him, and I remember him like a young son, and I'm an old grieving father. So that in itself to me is kind of a devastating moment. And it captures a lot about the passage of time and remembrance and grief. But I kind of want to ask my general poem here, or my general question here. If you agree with me, and you don't have to, that this is a poem that in some way is making an argument about what the nature and the experience of Jewish memory is, how would you describe what this poem is saying about Jewish memory? What does it mean to remember as a Jew, according to this poem? And maybe not just what does it mean, but what should it mean? Yeah. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking that memory goes way beyond what meets the eye. So just because you're looking at the face, don't forget the legs and the arms and the words, or the fist is really a palm with fingers. And so all what you're looking at is just the beginning. It's just the top layer of the surface.
Yeah, beautiful. And that makes me think of what we were saying about words as well, right? Don't forget that you have this plain meaning, but that's just the surface level. You have to remember all of the different substrata, I guess, whatever, beneath the surface level of the word. And here, all the different levels beneath the surface level of the face. Judith?
Also,
Judith, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. I'm sorry. Is it possible? Oh,
yeah,
that's much better.
yeah, it's my laptop. That's funny. Um, he takes all these negative images and is reminding you of positive aspects, and that even I like the one that that the road to terrible battles always passes by gardens and windows. Actually reminds me of a W.H. Auden poem, which is about suffering. And in the greatest of suffering, there is always, a horse scratching its back against the tree. And things just happen in life that keep going on. Life goes on. And he is sort of doing that. He's reminding you of springtime and the time the thorns were really soft, and bringing you back to positive aspects of life surrounding all this grim aspect of death.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
I'm not sure how that works into, I'd like you to explicate a little more how that works with your Jewish memory concept. I mean, this is a beautiful poem, and I just love his stuff.
Mhm.
But where in this poem do you see this being a function of Hebrew as memory?
It's a great question. I think one of the ways that I read this is as a kind of exhortation, and this is my own idiosyncratic reading, right? Feel free to disagree with me here. But one of the ways that I think of this poem is that it's sort of an exhortation to the Jewish people, specifically in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the aftermath of so much violence in the creation and the maintenance of the state of Israel, to not remember the violence and the grief and the loss as the whole story. I think to me, this is an acknowledgement that, like, yeah, you're going to have Yom HaZikaron. You're going to remember the terrible battles. You're going to remember the fist and the thorns and all of these kind of things that occasion suffering. And it's not that you shouldn't remember those. I don't think he's saying that, but I think he is saying you can't forget that that is not all there was, right? You can't forget, you can't let your memory of the Holocaust force you to forget all of the beauty and life and vibrancy that took place in Ashkenaz before that. And even during that, you can't forget your memory of these terrible battles, or you can't allow your memory of these terrible battles to force you to forget the gardens where those battles took place. So that's how I read it. I read this kind of as a broad statement about how Jews should remember our suffering in the 20th century. Yeah, Noah, were you going to say something?
Yeah, what really is the hinge point, the standout item for me is the switch from remember to remind, and wondering, how exactly those things relate. And I think in terms of speaking about how this relates to memory, and memory in the Jewish context, for me, I think I'd put it as memory as a verb as opposed to memory as a noun, and the process of remembering things and not having these still frames in isolation where that isn't really helpful. A lot of the time we can get fixated on a noun memory, and often something very traumatic, and just have that be it, as opposed to fleshing it back out into the full picture like you were talking about, and seeing both the roses and the thorns, seeing both the fruit and the tree, I know there aren't roses here, but there could be in the gardens that we passed. But really having it be a process, and like we, have Memorial Day and Independence Day adjoining each other. They aren't separated. They can't be separated. There's that little penumbra between the day that we can't identify as humans, but it's just one right into the other. And letting things exist as full stories, full pictures, letting them unravel, and like letting the tape keep rolling as you keep living, rather than getting stuck in the still frame with it, or getting stuck for the moment that you're dealing with a memory as opposed to experiencing memory. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
Yeah. And I like your use of the kind of cinematic analogy there. I think it's apt for this poem, which is very cinematic. I mean, we're going from, it feels to me like in this poem, we're going from scene to scene, frame to frame, instead of lingering on just one. And it feels to me like almost a movie where we're going back in time. You see the fist and then you see it unfurling. So yeah, I like that cinema analogy a lot. I think that's helpful for this. Yeah, Elle, I couldn't tell if your hand is still up or if you want to say something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would
great.
love to add also in the last stanza, there's the remember and the don't forget, which clearly plays off like the biblical of when it comes to Amalek, to remember and not forget. And we say it about the Holocaust also. There's definitely playing off of those like national phrases.
Yeah.
I just had a question, is the title is Hulikat? What is that?
I don't remember. I looked it up at one point and then I can't recall right now.
Okay,
I believe it was a place, but I would have to double check that because I don't want to say something incorrect.
thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, I think you're totally right. I mean, when we have a poem in Hebrew, even if it's so-called modern Hebrew, if it says Zachor in the poem, right? Remember, then that is a biblical allusion, whether or not the author wants it to be a biblical allusion. You can't avoid that fact. I think that's part of what Gershom Scholem was getting at. The way we use these languages, even if you're just saying like, remember to do the laundry today, whatever, there's a biblical lineage that you're calling upon when you tell somebody to remember in Hebrew. And I think Amichai, because he's a skillful poet, is aware of that and using that very intentionally here. I was thinking when I was preparing this, I was like, maybe I should just forget everything else and we should just talk about Amichai tonight. But we're not going to do that. Wow, there's so many phenomenal poems here, which we don't have time for. Let's go ahead and look at Amichai's poem, Jews in the Land of Israel, which really gets so explicitly at our questions here. What it means to think about Jewish memory, what it means to think about what it means to be a Jew in this place that, becomes the state of Israel. Does anybody else want to read this one? And if not, I'll take it away. Have folks come across this poem before? This one is maybe more anthologized, but I'm not sure. No, not so much. Okay, what's a phenomenal poem? So Jews in the Land of Israel. So we'll think about other ways remembering and forgetting kind of intersect in this poem. We forget where we came from. Our Jewish names from the exile give us away. Bring back the memory of flower and fruit, medieval cities, metals, knights who turned to stone, roses, spices whose scent drifted away, precious stones, lots of red, handicrafts long gone from the world, the hands are gone too. Circumcision does it to us, as in the Bible story of Shechem and the sons of Jacob, so that we go on hurting all our lives. What are we doing coming back here with this pain? Our longings were drained together with the swamps The desert blooms for us, and our children are beautiful. Even the wrecks of ships that sank on the way reached this shore. Even winds did, not all the sails. What are we doing in this dark land with its yellow shadows that pierce the eyes? Every now and then someone says, even after 40 or 50 years, the sun is killing me. What are we doing with these souls of mist, with these names, with our eyes of forests, with our beautiful children, with our quick blood? Spilled blood is not the roots of trees, but it's the closest thing to roots we have. That last stanza just like hits me every time. I wouldn't say that I understand it perfectly, but boy, does it have power. But let's look at the opening here again. We forget where we came from, right? We being Jews in the land of Israel. But our Jewish names from the exile give us away. Presumably, exactly the kinds of names that Amichai himself got rid of for himself, right? Ludwig Pfeffer becomes Yehuda Amichai. So, yeah, any responses to this poem or questions or moments that jump out at you? Yeah, Yael.
Would you say here that the memory here is burdensome to him, right? That the memory here is creating suffering. Is that, am I interpreting that properly?
I think so. I don't think it's he's hard to pin down often. He's really slippery, he's really ironic. But yeah, I do think here that for him, these memories are burdensome, they're painful, right? What are we doing coming back here with this pain? And yet at the same time, they're beautiful and they contain this incredible rich heritage, right? Flower and fruit, metals, roses, spices, precious stones. So on the one hand, these memories, our Jewish memory is this very painful thing. And on the other hand, he's pointing us, I think, to all these very sensual, tactile, kind of wonderful things that it enables us to access. I think it's a great question. I often think that he's deceptive in he seems to be much simpler than he really is. So it's a great question. Chaya, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'm really, really intrigued by the second stanza and his choice to include the Shem story.
Yeah.
Because where you expect a story of Jewish victimhood, we have this like rare, well, not actually rare in the Bible, actually, story of Jewish aggression, which or in one way or however you frame that, Jews as the victors, in a violent context. So it's a surprise to me. Like this juxtaposition, I expect it to go from Jewish victimhood to Jewish victory / violence, depending on your personal focus. But instead, we've got in the Jewish victimhood part, we've got that story, which seems really incongruous to me. I don't know what to make of it, but I'm struck by it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I have a question for everyone that this reminds me. Circumcision does it to us. What is the it there? What is he talking about?
What I'm getting, and this is just what I'm reading with the first two stanzas together, is all those beautiful things, those are surnames that Jews picked for themselves or had thrust upon them in exile. Those are common names for Jews. And when we had the option to choose, we chose nice things. We chose things that had some resonance with us. But those things also set us apart. They became, for the most part, Jewish names that made it obvious who you were in society. And circumcision also sets Jews apart. That is it. You're entering into the covenant. And maybe, walking down the streets in Ashkenaz, people don't necessarily know that about you, but it's something that is an identifier. And in a lot of societies around the world, I think we know that being set apart was pain, a very, big pain for Jews. And like Haya pointed out, like it is an interesting choice to have Shem here. But in exile, a lot of people probably felt that the amount of pain that they were going through as Jews wasn't necessarily justified. And I don't know that the folks of Shechem thought that their pain was justified. But yeah, that's just, I don't remember what the question was, so I'll stop now.
Yeah, no, this is great. It's such a rich poem. Yeah, Dad.
I love that line. Our longings were drained together with the swamp. And then he goes, the desert blooms for us and our children are beautiful. It's like everything, those two phrases are supposed to be gorgeous and wonderful, and they seem so mundane. Desert blooms for us and our children are beautiful. Because why? Because our longings were drained with the swamp. It's just a really cute, juxtaposition.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah,
part of the pain perhaps he's referring to in or the hurting that we have because our longings are gone.
yeah, absolutely. This is one of the moments where the tone is so slippery for me and hard to pin down, and I can't tell whether he's being sincere, whether he's being ironic. But I think you're totally right. It's a really interesting moment that he sort of just slides right by without kind of very skillfully not drawing too much attention to. I want to, yeah, Judith.
I just want to focus on the line. Even the wrecks of ships that sank on the way reached the shore.
Yeah, I love that moment. That's one of my favorite moments in this poem.
I think this poem is illustrative of Amichai's conflict, internal conflict, constantly with his Jewishness, his Israeliness, his not Jewish, his having been religious, stopping being religious, but not being able to let go of the language of religion. He's a great symbol of that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. He once said in an interview that if you want to raise your child to be a poet, you should raise them in a really strict religion and then let them leave it. So, do with that what you will. But yeah, I do want to just touch briefly on what Naomi wrote in the chat, which is, this last stanza, how disturbing it is. So Naomi wrote, our roots are more than only spilled blood. As the previous poem emphasizes, we should remember the good with the bad. It's a devastating closing stanza. It also seems to kind of come out of, I don't want to say come out of nowhere, but it's a very different tone in a lot of ways than much of the rest of the poem. What do we make of this? Spilled blood is not the roots of trees, but it's the closest thing to roots we have. I don't know that he really believes that. Certainly in the moment of this poem, he says it. Holistically, does he believe that? Who knows? Poets like to contradict themselves, but it's a really strange and devastating kind of moment. What are folks' responses to that?
I mean, there's a lot of emotional intensity in this, and I would love to have a cup of coffee with him and talk about this, but not an option right now. But
True.
The question of where home is, I think that there's some turmoil in that. We obviously know at this point that we didn't exactly belong in places other than Israel. We don't have roots there, regardless of whatever we tried setting up, because we were forcibly uprooted. And the roots that we do have there are blood, but then also in the foundations of Israel, when things yes, there was the yishuv and people were taking care of this, that, the other, but it wasn't like, if you look at Tel Aviv today, it wasn't comparable to, other places. What was being set down there in mass, not necessarily, by choice and by, real preference, was people's blood. So I could see there being, I don't know if I'm making sense, but there are these two things where there's, the home that you're uprooted from and the home that you haven't really managed to set down roots in yet. And the tension between those two.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. This poem is really filled with tensions, and in some ways, there are the tensions of Jewish memory and of Jewish identity in the 20th century. What are our roots? Where do we belong? What should we remember? What should we forget? What do we carry with us? What longings have been nullified? It's not a simple poem at all, I think. Yeah.
I just looked up,
Mm-hmm.
remind myself because I was looking at eyes of forests and I said, what's Yiddish for forest? It's Wald. And of course, it's right after all these names, all these allusions to Jewish names in exile. How many names end in Wald? Unbelievably.
Mm-hmm.
And you go from the forests of the eyes to the roots of trees. I mean, there's a tremendous interplay here of imagery.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chaya in the chat, do you want to just say briefly, Chaya, what you were typing out there, what you were thinking? I'm calling on you, so feel free to say no as well.
Thanks. If you don't mind just going over it, I'm just in a noisy place.
Yeah, no problem. But yeah, no, I'm really interested in what you're saying here about this this image of fields watered with blood. So after violence, but also you're pointing to this tradition that the blood of sacrifices in the biblical temple was used to water fields and, was a fertilizer. And people use blood meal as fertilizer, in gardens and farms today. So yeah, it's really interesting because it's such a violent kind of destructive image. But it's also at the same time, at least has the potential to be an image of life and growth.
I just had that flash, B'damai chayich.
Wonderful. Yeah. Could you translate that?
Well, I don't know if I mean, in your blood you will live.
Yeah, exactly. It's famously hard to translate, but
And
yeah.
It's said at circumcision time. So
Yeah.
that's connected to his earlier reference to the blood also of circumcision. But in your blood you will live. Maybe blood is not a negative concept here.
Well, that's a phenomenal point, and that really makes me want to reread and rethink this poem, right? Spilled blood is not the roots of trees, but it's the closest thing to roots we have, right? And maybe it's this beautiful lifeblood thing as opposed to the blood of violence, or maybe it's both, right? And maybe that's where the power of the poem comes from. Amazing stuff. This is great. We're basically out of time, so
Can I just make one more comment before
please.
I guess we close up? Also, the last, the spilled blood is making me think that the spilled blood almost undoes his first line of the poem because of the spilled blood, whether it's the blood of circumcision or the blood of the hardships of the land. We don't forget where we came from.
Yeah, it's great. I agree. Because I don't believe him when he says we forget where we came from. I think he's lying, or he's being sneaky or something. It's not, it's really a complex poem. So
A very Jewish poem.
And very Jewish, right? Contradicting itself, open to many different interpretations from many different perspectives all at the same time. Absolutely. What I'd like to do is just sort of mention briefly the other poems in this packet, and then we'll officially stop. But if anyone wants to stay a few minutes late, we'll just read one more poem together, but no pressure to stay. So I have some other wonderful Amichai poems here, highly recommended. I have a poem here, which is a very good Yom HaZikaron poem by Tet Karmi, who was a really interesting Israeli poet, made Aliyah as a young man, translated. He was best known, well, he was known for a lot of things. He's an influential poet, editor, wrote beloved children's books, and also was really the great translator of Shakespeare into Hebrew, or one of the greats. And then we're not going to look either at this poem by Itzik Manger, who was one of the great Yiddish poets. And this is a poem that he wrote on his Aliyah, on his emigration to Israel. It's also very complex. But I wanted to close with Shirley Kaufman. So Shirley Kaufman is not as well known as she deserves to be. She was born in 1923, died in 2016, made Aliyah in the early 70s, but continued always writing in English, even when she lived in Jerusalem, and was sort of I don't know, in some ways, my understanding is she was sort of an elder stateswoman for a lot of English language poets in Israel. And she has a lot of wonderful poems that deal quite explicitly with these questions of Jewish language. Which one should we read? Let's read Brest Litovsk. Litovsk. Yeah. I'll also just point out that the title of her collected poems is called Roots in the Air. So interesting to think about that, along with Amichai's claim about our roots. But anyway, let's go ahead and read this poem, and we'll close with that. My mother remembered how she sat in the cart beside her father when he rode through the lands of the absent landlord collecting the rents. It was near Brest Litovsk. The names kept changing and the peasants would stare at them and pay. Peasant to grandfather, Pole to Jew, each greasing the other, steps that went nowhere like the road to the border. When the Cossacks came charging through the town, they bolted the doors and windows and hid under the beds. They put pillows over the children's mouths to stop their cries. There was no summer in this landscape. Even the language disappeared. 50 years later, all she remembered was her father's white shirt. I think I have a typo there. That was always clean. 50 years later, all she remembered was her father's white shirt that was always clean. So she's describing a relatively mundane situation, right? In a lot of places in Eastern Europe, Jews were sort of the middlemen between aristocratic Christian landowners and Christian peasants. And this accounted for a lot of anti-Semitism, as you can imagine, and the Jews didn't really have a choice but to be in this position. And so that's her grandfather collecting the rents of these peasants. And the Cossacks come through town. And her mother remembers this, but we end on this note. 50 years later, all she remembered was her father's white shirt that was always clean. What do you make of that closing statement? Again, it's really complex and contradictory, I think, because we've just heard about what she remembers. She remembers the Cossacks coming through. She remembers all of these different things. How do you read that? I'm curious to ask.
My first impulse is kind of, I won't say the opposite of the other poem where I was talking about, a still frame versus, movement. Memory is a process versus individual noun memory. But I think that this can happen. Like, you can have a small still frame memory because something is traumatic or you just don't remember. But I think sometimes people choose to have more simplistic memories of things, either through some sort of maturity, or other things happening in life. And maybe she actually does still remember everything. People's memory, does start to go sometimes, but maybe this is the memory that she's choosing to participate in, that she's choosing to remember. This is what I want to remember about this situation. And I think there can be value in that too. But again, that's just one idea.
Yeah. No, thank you for starting us off with that. I think you're right here. There's kind of an ambivalence, right? I can read this as like, all she remembered was her father's white shirt because the trauma of her memories caused her to block everything else out. But we can also think of it almost as the opposite. All she remembered was her father's white shirt because it was so lovely and such a kind of, I don't know, beautiful sense memory. Both of those things seem to me true here at once, or possible at least. Judith, what were you going to say?
I think a man in a white shirt is an image of dignity.
Mm-hmm. Could you just lean a little bit closer to the microphone? Sorry, Judith.
I
No,
think
thank you.
in a white shirt is an image of dignity of some sort. And to have him come out of this horrible scenario where he was forced to play the role that he was playing, gathering the rent, etc., and all the surrounding history that we know of, what she remembers is a kind of dignity that her father had in spite of it all. It's a very sudden image, right?
Yes.
It hits you very strongly.
It hits very strongly, and nothing in the poem really anticipates it, right? Yeah, so I think you're totally right that it's sudden. And I think what you just said, that, so she remembers the dignity he maintained throughout this kind of degraded and degrading situation. That in itself is a claim about the experience of Jewish memory. To choose to remember dignity instead of, or maybe not instead of, but within degradation, right? It would be a very interesting poem, or a very different poem, and not as interesting if it ended 50 years later, all she remembered was her father's dirty shirt. It's like, okay. But the fact that it ends on this image of cleanliness, and I think you're right, dignity, is really striking precisely because it's in such sharp juxtaposition and even contradiction to everything we've seen thus far in the poem. And I think that is a statement about Jewish memory, or about what Jewish memory can be, about the choices that we can make about what and how to remember our experiences as Jews.
Can
So
I just make
yeah, please.
one last comment? This is a bit of a stretch, but the clause, even the language disappeared, to me is a clue that she's saying the language disappeared for what I really want to say. And all I can say is what I wish I could say, almost. But I wish I could say that all I remembered. But the language that disappeared was something like a statement, 40 years later, I wish that all I remembered was. And that part of the thing kind of disappeared because the trauma was so great that she can't even say what happened. I don't know if that was coherent or not.
Yeah, that's really, so you're saying even the language disappeared as a way of her gesturing towards, I actually can't say this. I
Yeah,
don't
so
have
I'm going to say
words.
this. I'm going to say this because this is what you want to hear.
Hmm. That's interesting. Kind of a pessimistic reading, I would say, but
Yes.
that's really interesting. Because I think we could say just the flip side is I don't have language for this. So I'm going to say not what you want to hear, but what I choose, the language that I choose.
Right. A
But
slightly more optimistic way.
yeah. No, either way, I think it's really interesting. And I think, it's one of the things that I love about a lot of her poems is some ways like Amichai. They seem quite simple. She's saying, okay, this happened, then this happened, and here's what I remember. But actually, as soon as we start talking about it and teasing it apart, it reveals itself to be not simple at all, but quite complex, quite contradictory. Yeah. So since we're already over time, oh yeah, Elle, did you want to add something? I just
Yes,
enjoy these conversations so much. I can't stop them.
it's really beautiful. Also, there's this idea of she doesn't have the language disappeared, but the images of the memories have stuck with her because
Hmm.
we can literally picture everything that she wrote. So the memories to her maybe are, it's not about the language, it's about visual memory.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great. It reminds me of William Carlos Williams, the great American poet. He says, "No ideas, but in things." So it's like, yeah, I don't have words, I don't have ideas about this. I just have the sense of the things themselves. I don't know, maybe that's a stretch, but that's what that made me think of.
I was thinking with what Jim said, bringing it back to the idea of Jewish memory, there is this idea of sort of curating the memories that you pass down in your family and the ethics of that. And there are families who tell their story and there are families who don't talk about it. And sometimes someone in a family that doesn't talk about it will kind of let something slip and then think the better of it later, reduce things and, really commit to something more condensed, something more pleasant. And that, I think that's a big question for Jews. That's a big question communally. That's a big question in different families. That's a big question individually, between, telling the truth and trying to protect, the people who you love. And the question of what happens to your memories when they become something that someone else is carrying. Do you want your grandchildren? Do you want them carrying around, these traumatic stories, or do you want them to carry around like an idea of a secure attachment where you're safe and you always remember your father's clean shirt? And yeah, I that feels very Jewish to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Any
beautiful.
further thoughts before we bid each other adieu for the week?
As always, there's so much more that we could say about all of this, but I just really want to thank all of you for being here. I know there was stuff in the chat that I didn't get the chance to get to, but I'm going to read through that in a moment. So thank you for your contributions there as well, even if we didn't get to discuss them. But yeah, really thanks to everyone who was here, everyone who listened, everyone who participated. Really grateful that we get to have these wonderful conversations together.
And I will turn it around and thank you, Mr. Kraft, as always, for a wonderful, wonderful class. And thank everyone here for your very enthusiastic and thoughtful participation.
Yeah.
I love just watching one of these classes unfold with everyone's individual thoughts and experiences, really opening up a poem. That's what it is. You have to pull it apart gently and insert yourselves into it. So as usual, Drisha has lots of other programs coming up this Zman, and we are still accepting applications for our summer kollel programs. You can learn more about those things on our website, drisha.org. And anything to point out in particular? happy Yom Ha'atzmaut to everyone. And I hope that if you are participating in any festivities, you make only good memories with your loved ones. So everyone, please have a wonderful week, and we hope to learn with you again soon.
Yeah, and we'll continue next week. So hope to see you for the final session of this series on the poetry of Jewish memory at this time next week.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Great. Well, thanks as always. All right. Laila Tov.